Okay, I've got 4 different cameras here. I thought you'd get a kick out of this. Looking at technology over several different years, we have the Fuji X-T2, the Nikon D500, the Nikon D810, and the Nikon D3 from 2008. Oh my God! Let's check out the dynamic range and the pixel pitch, because everything when it comes to cameras, people don't realize a camera is not a sensor. A camera is an image processor. Improvements in 80 converters and SNR firmware and the technology of actually processing the image is actually as, if not more important in most cases than the actual sensor itself. Let's take a look at the X-T2 first off. That's 3.93 micrometers, dynamic range of 7 stops. Now the other 3 cameras, the Nikons, I use the exact same lens on the 3 Nikon cameras. I did not on the X-T2. So we can call this, I don't know, just 1 point of reference, but I used a different lens on the X-T2, but the dynamic range is still accurate. We have 3 stops up and 3 stops down, and basically a 4 micrometer pixel pitch, basically, although B is 3.9. Let's take a look now at save the best for last. Take a look at the Nikon D500 with a 4.2 micrometer pixel pitch. We have a dynamic range of 7.3 stops. As you can tell, and as I've said before, the Nikon D500 is very sensitive. It has a sensitive little butt when it comes to specular highlights. You can actually see that the clipping point here is only 2.8 on the speculars, whereas it's 3.5 down. So Nikon D500 unquestionably is sensitive to speculars. And this is using the best light meter in the world. Consistent lenses across the board, very, very consistent lighting. This was taking incident meter readings and reflectance readings and using data transfer advanced software for analysis of a passport photo taken at correct exposure, 3 stops up and 3 stops down. So this is all of these graphs are conglomerations of 3 different images to analyze the true dynamic range. So this is not just one image. All of these are 3 combined images taken in analysis. Let's compare the Nikon D500. Let's save the best for last. Here we have 7.7 stops of dynamic range, 4.8 micrometer pixel pitch. Obviously we have a 36 megapixel sensor on the Nikon D810, a full frame camera. We have 2.7 stops clipping point on the speculars and 4.1 EV stops on the shadow. Now let's take a look at something somewhat shocking, and it wasn't shocking to me, but some of you probably will find it shocking if I can find the Nikon D3 file. Nikon D3 has huge honking photo sites on it, 8.4 micrometers. It is a 12 megapixel camera, obviously so, but let's take a look and compare to the Nikon D810, which has almost, not exactly, but kind of close, half the pixel pitch, but we have much improved 80 conversion. So we're talking about 2 sensors. The Nikon D3 has huge honking photo size. Now the low light performance on the D810 isn't that great, but it's certainly a whole hell of a lot better than the Nikon D3, even though the pixel pitch is much smaller. So we have improvement in technology from 2008 to 2014 isn't when the Nikon D810 came out. But take a look at the dynamic range. The dynamic range is basically identical. If we allow for variance between the two, it's quite astounding. Now let's take a look at the clipping point on the speculars. We have 4 stops on the speculars on the clipping point on the Nikon D3 because it takes longer to bring them to saturation than it does on the Nikon D810, which is more sensitive even though the pixel pitch is significantly smaller. So it takes a good deal longer to bring the D3 saturation point to break the threshold on the specular highlights. So we have 4 stops up and 2.7 stops down. So we obviously don't have, compared to the Nikon D500 or the D810, if we take a look at the bottom end or our shadows, we have very quick fall off, whereas we have a sloping fall off on the D810. We have on the Nikon D3, wah, it immediately falls right into the crapper on the Nikon D3 when it comes to the shadows. As you could tell from this graph here, if you take a look at this graph, we got a lot of specular headroom here due to slow saturation on the speculars, but on the shadows, the Nikon D3, wah, we lose it. Whereas the Nikon D810, if we take a look at the bottom slopes like a slide here, Nikon D810 gently slides into the shadows. Shadow detail, baby. Yeah, even though the pixel pitch is almost half that of the Nikon D3. Whereas the Nikon D3, wah, right off the cliff. Yeah, baby. Now let's compare that to the Nikon D500. Let's take a look at the clipping points. We really can't compare the clipping points because of the saturation value. Let's take a look at the Fuji X-T2 by comparison. If I could actually find it, which maybe I can't. I know it's here somewhere. There we go. It's hard to find this stuff buried. And 3 on the shadows, and we have 2.7. Basically the same on the shadows. Now, we are talking over twice as big on the pixel pitch on the D3 as compared to the X-T2. 24 megapixel sensor here on a smaller sensor, the APS-C crop sensor, and 8.4 micrometer pixel pitch on the Nikon D8III. And once again, on the specular highlights, we have just a longer burn-in time to reach saturation to blow out the speculars. But dynamic range, 7.6 stops versus 7 stops. So here we have the 2008 Nikon D3, but I mean, it is a huge honking sensor with large photo sites, but we do have more dynamic range. Now let's compare the Nikon D3 as opposed to the D500. We have a better dynamic range, I forget by what, not by much, but almost half a stop. No, not exactly half a stop, but we do have more dynamic range on the old Nikon D3. But it is a full-frame sensor. It's like, yeah, but it's a full-frame sensor from 2008 as opposed to Nikon D500 from 2016. I hope you like this video. This gives you a really interesting peek-see, and this is as hardcore as it gets. I mean, all the variables have been taken care of in these graphs, so these are actually extremely accurate. So we have a Nikon D810 here, and a Nikon D3, and we basically have the same performance except for shadow detail right here. Wow, right off the cliff, and nice gently sloping slide on the Nikon D810, even though the pixel pitch is much smaller, but we have improved technology. So this confirms everything else that all the other techie sites say, but it's easier to look at this on the graph. And remember, these are not single images to show the dynamic range and the clipping points of these cameras. These are 3 images combined. Correct exposure, 3 stops up and 3 stops down, and then extrapolated in compilation into one profile. Thanks for watching so much. If you like this video, you can drop a bug or 2. You can tell me to jump off a cliff. I hope I gave you an interesting look at cameras, both old and new, and the fact that there's really not a tremendous amount of difference between ye old Nikon D3 and the Nikon D810, except for shadow detail, of course. Bye.